amazing film a few years ago called Out of the Furnace with Christian Bale. Did you see that? A very raw, authentic story, much like this one in feel, I think. Had you seen that film, or did you come to this script fresh?
I had seen the film, and then, but I didn't rewatch it having read the script. But there is something about his writing, and I remember feeling it when I saw that film, that it was just something so real about it, which is the kind of cinema that I crave. And you find in Europe, but not often here, and it just felt authentic. And this film just was completely vivid and alive on the page. I think he's an amazing writer, and for a straight white man to have written this film that's very, very female-centric and really has a real intuitive understanding of a female experience that I could relate to in some ways. It's really impressive.
So there's a European film flavour to it, but I think there's also a period of like a 70s feel to it. Can you talk about that? Like, not that it's set in the 70s, obviously, but just you feel like you're watching a film that was perhaps made in the 70s.
That's the biggest compliment that you could ever give any film. And that was a golden era of cinema. And I think, I understand what you're saying. It feels sort of epic, even though it's small, and it feels character driven, and it's I like that it doesn't tie everything up in a neat little bow, that you sort of, hopefully that the characters will live in you. And I still to this day imagine, like, where's Deb now? What's she doing? And me and Jake Scott, the director, make up these stories that she's a lesbian in Santa Fe in a crystal shop or something. And we just, they were so alive, and that's the cinema that I love and worship, and the acting of that era was second to none. It just, you look at the movies that didn't win Best Picture, and it's just astounding, the cinema that was being made in that decade. So if it has that feeling, that's fantastic.
Definitely, and it's, I think, something to do also with it, that you shot it on location, so there are no sets in the film whatsoever, even the interiors, correct? They're shot in homes.
Yeah, they were real homes. They were styled a little bit, but they were, the houses were opposite each other, and we shot within each house and spent a lot of time kind of almost living inside each house. I remember we had, before we started shooting, we rehearsed, which never happens these days. So we actually got a week or 10 days of rehearsal, and we had pizza night at Kath's and beer night at Deb's, and we all spent time so that by the time we came to shooting in these really tiny spaces, they were very familiar. There's something about turning a kettle on that you've sort of used in your day-to-day life that just, it feels real if you've done it without being filmed doing it.
I saw the film last week, I think, and I was thinking back on it, and is there a scene that you are not in? Is there one scene? I don't think so. I mean, you've all just seen it, so tell me if I'm wrong, but my feeling is that we only see things from the point of view of Deb. We're only seeing what you see, we only know what you know. So what effect do you think that has on us, the audience?
I mean, it's the first, I think it's the first proper lead I've ever played in a film, so I've never really thought about it in terms of what effect, except you see it all through my eyes, which is quite a nice feeling. You know, it's centered around this woman's experience, but at the same time it doesn't indulge it. It feels very honest, it feels very flawed, she feels very real and messy and chaotic. But I feel I loved her. I sort of loved her for all her chaos and all her trying and all her moxie. And I think that it's powerful. I think we see a lot of films through men's perspective, through the eyes of man, and it's one man's journey and one man's mission and one man's life story. It's refreshing to have that, and to be in charge of that perspective as an actor is refreshing.
But also interesting, I think, because sometimes when you see a film from one person's perspective, it can be narrow, whereas this film doesn't feel narrow. I felt like I knew this family, I felt everyone. I think that the sign of a great movie is when you think to yourself, wow, I could see a film about Kath, for instance, like that relationship, that would have been a great film. Or her husband, is it Will Sasso?
Terry, yeah.
Unbelievable. I would have happily seen offshoots of
maybe we should just do sequels. Kath, Terry, Deb.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's an interesting thing. I think it's a testament to Jake's direction that everybody had their moment, you got to fall in love and understand each character in this. And there's something really relatable. I mean, we all hopefully haven't had to experience half of the things that Deb experiences, but if you scratch at any family, there's something familiar about this family, I think, to a lot of people, certainly to me, and I've had a much more privileged and blessed life, but there's something familiar about the dynamics that is just, and it makes you feel connected to other humans. I think that's where cinema can be really powerful.
Well, there was such a comfort between you and your sister, and your character and your sister, and the conflict, or the sort of tension between you and your mother was all too real, I think, for anybody who has a mother, any woman who has a mother, perhaps. You said that you got to rehearse. Did you, was it just natural then, by spending time with these actors, that you came to be that comfortable?
It's really hard to articulate how that happens, because you can obviously pretend if it's not happening authentically,
You're
but
an actor.
yeah. And get away with it, unfortunately, sometimes. But there was something about this, and I really think it has to come from a director ultimately. I mean, there are amazing actors in every role, and that's a given. And it was the closest cast and crew that I've ever been a part of, so everybody was collaborative and everybody was sort of sharing the experience. But there was a magic that happened, I think, for us, and that comes from Jake Scott. He just has a real innate ability to create an environment that matches the mood of whatever scene you're doing that day, and it's hard to define. It sort of exists. But every day that I would walk on set and have to be either distraught or kind of messy or funny or whatever it was, the vibe of the set was that energy, which sounds really cosmic and annoying, but true. It's true.
So this is technically a period film. I mean, it's the near past, so it's not like, you know, you're dressing up in corsets or whatever, but there's a very distinct look to you, I think, and to everyone in it. Did you have a lot to say? Do you enjoy getting involved in that level, like what I'm going to wear, how my hair, what kind of beer I'm going to drink? Do you get involved in that nitty gritty? Or
I do. Yeah, that's where it all tends to come together. I mean, I spent a lot of time with the script, maybe a year working on it before, because it's hard to get an independent film made, and it kept pushing, and then it got to a point where I was praying that it just wouldn't happen because it started to feel so enormous and daunting. But within that time, I really had a clear, I think from the first moment I read it, I had a very clear vision of who she was. So that kind of early 90s, very low slung jeans with, I don't even know whether you see the kind of thong poking out, but I was adamant that I had this whale tail thong that you don't see, but I knew it was there. And that's early messy Deb with a push-up bra, and then gradually she just strips down to this kind of, not defeated, but no vanity, no sex. She's just sort of a woman managing and coping, and from the chaos and all the movement at the beginning to end up still and not at all considering how she looks was something that I was very actively involved in. And I had an opinion much more about early Deb than late Deb, because I think she had more of an opinion at that point. But we also had an incredible costume designer, Alex Bovary, who was completely on the same page.
So the tragedy in the story obviously is not resolved in any Hollywood way that we would perhaps expect at the beginning of the film. Maybe at the beginning of the film we're thinking, okay, it's going to be the brother-in-law or the married man. There's going to be some crime procedural here, and it's all going to be resolved. And it isn't, which I loved about that. And it's also not about that, is it?
Yeah, it's funny. Some people, I remember showing an earlier cut to friends, and they were like, that they thought that it was the boyfriend, or that they had those things, and it was worrying to me that people would think it was a thriller. It's kind of a hard thing to market in that sense. But no, it's not about that at all. And we shot many versions. We actually shot an 11-minute conversation with the killer, so I know exactly what happened. Yeah. And Jake decided in the edit to remove it, because he said, as soon as you go to the place where she's found, you know exactly what happened. And I was like, part of me was frustrated because it was interesting, but it was gratuitous perhaps. And I think that was a really bold directorial choice, because it's not about who's done it or details. It's about the effect and the resilience and the triumph of this woman in spite of all the knocks she received.
So despite the camaraderie that you had on set, and you said you sort of lived with each other and it was intimate with the family, was it a heavy film to make, or could you sort of transcend that and leave it at the office, so to speak?
No, it was really heavy. It was really, really heavy. It's impossible for it not to be, just because of the nature of what you're discussing and how that kind of grief can never be far away, I think, from all the people that I'd spoken to who had lost children, and I spoke to many. No matter how well they're coping or how capable they are of really interacting in a world and managing, it's just right there beneath the surface, the grief. And also, more than the grief is the not knowing. I think that's worse. I remember that in the moment where I see where Bridget was found and touch the ground and feel where she lay, that was a direct, I suppose I got that information from a woman who's the film is actually dedicated to. When she found her son's remains, it was almost elation. It was the happiest she'd felt, which was totally not how I would imagine it, but it made some sort of sense. So there's peace in the knowledge of knowing. Sorry if that's so heavy, but it was really, yeah, it was crushing. It still is close.
Yeah, I was in floods of tears at that point, several times actually throughout the movie. I found it incredibly moving. But how do you, first of all, where do you find people to go, oh, I'm doing a movie, can I talk to you about, your loss? I mean, how do you approach that part of your job?
I mean, in as sensitive a way as you can manage, but Jake had reached out to kind of bereavement centres for people with missing children, who were really helpful in us kind of handling the tone of that right. And then I actually have a friend in New York who lost his son a few years ago, who was really informative. But we worked with the producers and Brad, and we all worked with many people within the kind of bereavement centres who were available on the phone before scenes and all the time. I think there was catharsis maybe in talking about it, which makes sense, I think, as humans.
So let's go back to the director, Jake Scott. Obviously, he's the son of Ridley Scott. That's a huge nightmare burden, perhaps. Yeah, he's making his own way, and I think this is his best work so far. What's he like? He looks just like Ridley Scott.
He looks exactly like Ridley Scott. He is incredible. He's English, which was nice. He's very feminist, which I think was essential for this story. He's kind of emotional and loving and warm. The most generous, intuitive director that I've worked with, for sure. In that way that I described, of just like intuiting what was needed and how to manage it. It's sometimes there are so many people on a set doing so many different things, like to command or ask for the space that you need to get to whatever place you need to is not something that comes easily to me. I think it's an English thing. I'm just apologizing constantly, which is fucking enraging. Everyone's like, sorry, I've got to cry, could you just not be on the phone really loudly? But Jake sort of knew how to create that environment, and actually the crew remarkably were as invested in it. I think we all fell in love with the script and this woman and the family. So the operators would be crying when I had to cry, and Jake would be sobbing behind it. It was just very, very united as an experience. Yes, he's great.
Absolutely. It seems like the film could be called American Family just as much. That goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, I felt like I was watching a full family, not just you, even though everything was told through your perspective. So I think that's...
it's very much about it was called The Burning Woman before.
Oh.
And then everyone thought that sounded a little bit too thriller.
No, it sounds like The Burning Bed, that Farrah Fawcett film. Do you remember
The Burning Wood?
Bed.
Oh, yes.
Bed.
Yeah.
Farrah Fawcett film.
No, it could be called American Family, or yeah.
I hope you aren't offended when I say this, but I feel like I often don't recognize you in films. Is that something you hear a lot?
Compliment.
I know it probably is as an actor, but you know what I mean. I look back over your body of work, and I've been covering films for a long, long time. So I remember you in Factory Girl. I remember you, in a lot of things, and I just haven't pinpointed you for the longest time. How do you manage that? How do you manage to stay clear of being, the Hollywood starlet?
I don't know. I think it's just choice. I think the goal has always been to play characters. It makes it's a longer game, I suppose, than there's an easier route perhaps if you're kind of versions of yourself and things. I think it's maybe easier and certainly more commercial and more lucrative ultimately, but I love character, I love theatre, I love playing completely different people. So if you don't recognise me, that would be the ultimate compliment for someone who wants to play character roles.
And I listened to a British podcast about film, and I heard them say that they don't say character actor in Britain. People aren't known as character actors.
They just say actor.
They're just
so
actors.
British.
Is that true?
It's very pretentious. I don't know. Yeah, probably. Yeah, but there are people. There are movie stars. You go to see their movies. Tom Cruise. You know what you're going to get, and it's great. And it's Tom Cruise or versions of him. And then there are. Both equally noble, but then there are people who don't have to be the kind of front and center of everything and tell a story. I think I'm more comfortable in that space.
Right.
Cut to some Marvel.
All right. Do we have questions from the audience? Right. Yeah.
The performance was so amazing, and the reason I say that is I know that person. I dated her. Her name is Regina. How did you get? My question is, how did you get these mannerisms? And where did this person come from for you? Like, how did you channel this person?
I don't know. It's frustrating. It's such a difficult thing to talk about because I read it and I knew her. And maybe everybody knows a Deb. I have an aunt who likes the odd glass of white wine and who goes like when she's having a couple of drinks. There were like little things I was like, ooh, that I start to study. But on the whole, it was just clear. Thank you.
Gentleman behind.
The last few roles I've seen you in, High Rise, Lost City of Zed, there's kind of quality of being a woman at the center of a lot of madness, kind of holding it together. Is there a through line to the choices that you're making in the last movie you made?
No, I just take what I'm offered.
No.
I wish there was, I'm going to lie, yes, there is. I want to play women who are keeping it together. But no, they're so different, but I understand that there's some sort of thread. But I think it's quite feminine, that resilience and that strength. I think Deb doesn't have a choice, and she's managing badly, but managing. And no one says, where's the father? And you can judge her behavior at the beginning, but she's raised a kid.
I feel like I need to ask someone who isn't in the front row. Do we have any questions from you, sir?
Beautiful work. And you might have touched on this earlier, but especially in the beginning where I feel like it's the most natural performance of someone who's just manic and chaotic and that personality. Like some of the other things, where you found that energy, getting that chaos out, but it's so real and natural.
I had to really map it out because we shot this movie in 28 days and we didn't shoot it in order. And that's, you forget about that when you watch a film, but I had 3 chapters of Deb, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. So I had to very clearly make decisions about what chapter Deb would look like, dress like, hair like, and behave like. And wanted her to never stop moving, jumping, hopping, because she's just restless and she's dissatisfied, and she's also allowed to be the 16-year-old that she wasn't allowed to be when she had a kid at 16. So she's this weird amalgam of woman-child mess. And then chapter 3, Deb should be still at some point, So it was like a color-coded script with pink association early Deb, green chapter 3 Deb, and just that it just takes a lot of work, solitary work. But a choice, yeah.
Those scenes when you're with the family and you're all, you go into the fridge, you're getting a beer, just the sort of chaos, it really came across with the direction too. Is it easier to shoot those scenes where I imagine that you're not hitting your marks and saying your line? It seems like is it perhaps more improvised? I don't know.
There was a lot of freedom within the space. So I think we had 3 cameras for some of those things, which means you don't have to have marks, which suits me because I'm dreadful technically. But I hit Christina on the head, and I actually hit her by accident, which I think is in the film. Jake kind of really helped create that environment. There was music on set, it was loose, and everybody was just up for it. Everybody was there definitely not for the money. Like, we loved this script, so there was just a level of commitment and playing to those scenes, also knowing where it was going to go. Like, it had to be funny. It had to be, otherwise it's just torture, the film. So we were focused on that, and it wasn't hard. Did you still have a question?
Along these same lines, you mentioned, I've seen you on stage too, and I'm always fascinated the difference between rehearsal and people saying when they're shooting they don't want to rehearse because they want to feel spontaneous. And so how do you feel about that divide between theater and film? And just how so spontaneous, especially with the Sienna your chemistry is off the charts with her.
She's amazing. I think rehearsal only makes you better, but that's probably from doing plays. Just where, and also when you start a play, where you begin and where the play ends up, having done it that many times, you don't stop learning if it's good material. And also, if you're playing people who know each other and have had a life together, like, you better kind of construct some form of memory together in order for it to feel real, but that really rarely happens in cinema. So the fact that we had this time to rehearse, I think, really helped with the relationships that you saw, and Jake had backstories, and my relationship with my father, we had extensive conversations on what that was. So you're just arriving with the texture, whether it's talked about or not, but you're aware that there's a life that's been lived before this movie starts, which sometimes you don't feel.
We have time for one more question. Do you want to pick the last question?
Hi, I just want to thank you. I thought it was a very powerful film and very American character. And I just wanted to say that there's a scene that I will never get out of my head, that is after the car crash and the fire in the background and the white image of you in white just walking towards the camera in that. And I mean, it's just such a powerful image, and then there's a transition, but that image, I don't think I'll ever get it out of my head. It was so beautiful.
That's so good. That was the last thing we ever shot on the whole movie.
Oh,
So there was it was so loaded for all of us, and at the end there was champagne and crying, and but it was like, I knew on that walk that I was walking towards the end of what had been a devastating and fulfilling experience, but it was loaded. So that's nice.
It's a loaded film. Thank you.
Thank you.
The film opens Friday. Everyone go see it again. Take your friends, tell everyone to go see it. Let's support this film. And Sienna Miller, thank you so much.
Thank you.